At 3:47 on a cold, salt-heavy dawn in the Philippine Sea, December 1944, Petty Officer Calvin Roebuck, a U.S. Navy engineer with Task Force 38, crouched on the starboard catwalk of the USS Wichita. Wind tore at his face. Seawater sprayed in sheets. And somewhere beyond the dark horizon, two distant silhouettes, Japanese battleships, were trading thunderous bursts of 14-inch gunfire with the American fleet. But Roebuck wasn't manning an anti-aircraft gun or preparing damage control teams. He was calibrating something far stranger. Bolted to the ship's railing beside him was a homemade acoustic triangulation device, a crude Frankenstein of spare sound-powered phone parts, a gutted radar junction box, salvaged aircraft wiring, and the frame of a broken Polaris. It looked more like an amateur radio experiment than naval equipment. And, in a sense, that's exactly what it was. The Wichita had lost part of its fire control radar during a night surface engagement the evening before. Smoke, shockwave overpressure, and a glancing shell fragment had crippled the system, leaving the cruiser partially blind at the worst possible moment. The Japanese force, heavy ships running fast, was still out there, hunting. Roebuck's improvised device, if it worked, would provide the gunnery team with approximate bearings using sound delay, ocean resonance, and onboard vibrations. An insane idea the Navy never would have approved officially. But in the chaos of war, innovation often crawled out of desperation. Now kneeling on steel slick with seawater, Roebuck tightened a brass clamp and listened to the low, rolling tremor of distant naval artillery echo across the waves. He adjusted the gain coil, wiped condensation off the contact plate, and checked the hand-soldered wiring for the 10th time. He had maybe 1 minute to finish calibration, maybe less, because the Japanese battleships had changed course. Roebuck could feel it literally in the deck plates under his boots. And what he didn't know yet was that the survival of the Wichita's forward batteries, and possibly of the cruiser itself, would hinge on whether this fragile, improvised device could read the next enemy salvo before the shells arrived. Roebuck steadied himself as another distant salvo rolled across the sea, a deep, bone-humming vibration that traveled through the Wichita's hull before the sound ever reached his ears. The ocean seemed to exhale with each burst, low, thunderous, unervingly methodical. He pressed the metal diaphragm of his device against the catwalk deck, watching the needle quiver on the improvised resonance gauge. Too weak, he thought. The signal needed more amplification, or the gunnery team wouldn't be able to interpret it in time. He reached for a small screwdriver in his breast pocket, but the ship jolted hard as a near miss erupted off the port bow, lifting a wall of seawater and shrapnel skyward. Roebuck ducked instinctively as fragments clanged against the superstructure. Engineer Roebuck, you still in one piece? A voice called from the gun deck above. Chief Fire Controlman Hensley. Roebuck wiped brine from his face. Still working, Chief. We need that bearing. Next enemy salvo could walk right into U.S. He knew Hensley wasn't exaggerating. Without radar, the Wichita's forward turrets were effectively firing blind. They could track muzzle flashes, sure, but by the time a flash was spotted, plotted, and relayed, the Japanese shells were already airborne. Roebuck's device had to read the sound delay between distant muzzle blasts and hull vibrations, giving early direction estimates. Crude, imperfect, but fast. He tightened the final screw, felt the coil warm beneath his fingers, and tapped the resonance plate again. This time the needle jumped, clean, sharp, responsive. Good. The device was awake. But there was a problem. The Wichita's starboard lookout suddenly shouted down from the platform above. Flashes, bearing 210. Multiple. Enemy salvo inbound. Roebuck's skin prickled. The Japanese battleships had not only changed course, they had bracketed the Wichita's projected escape path. If they were firing now, it meant they'd gotten a near-perfect firing solution on the cruiser's last maneuver. Roebuck slammed his headset on and patched into the gunnery line. Roebuck online device calibrated. Feeding you bearing now. He pressed the diaphragm hard against the catwalk. The sea trembled. A low-frequency roll, almost below hearing, vibrated up through the hull. The resonance needle danced left, held, then snapped right. Roebuck read the bearing. Bearing 213. Enemy salvo fired from 16,000 yards and closing fast. Hensley's voice shot back. Confirm. Roebuck didn't hesitate. Confirmed. Above him, gears groaned as the 8-inch turret slewed to a line. But Roebuck wasn't done. His device suddenly spiked hard as a second tremor rippled through the hull. Not a muzzle flash, not a distant echo. This was different. Faster, sharper. Incoming shells. Already airborne. Roebuck's heart hammered. He knew the next few seconds would decide everything. He leaned over the catwalk railing, scanning the dark horizon. The sea bulged, 3 distinct swells forming out of nowhere. And then he realized his mistake. Those weren't swells. They were shell splashes from the previous salvo, marking exactly where the Japanese gunners believed the Wichita would be next. The next salvo would land on that spot, and that spot was directly in the Wichita's projected path if she maintained speed. Roebuck tore off his headset and bolted for the nearest voice tube. He didn't think. He yelled, "Bridge, this is Roebuck. Do not hold course. Enemy is walking shells into our track. Turn now." For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the Wichita's horn blared once. Acknowledgement. The ship heeled hard to port as her rudder bit into the sea. Engines groaning. Spray exploding over the bow. Roebuck clung to the railing, just as the next Japanese salvo descended. 3 titanic plumes erupted behind the Wichita, exactly where she would have been had she held course. The bridge had listened, and Roebuck's device had bought them precious seconds. But what he didn't know yet, what no one aboard realized, was that the Japanese battleships were adjusting again. Their firing solution was tightening, and within minutes, the Wichita would be forced into a duel she could not win blindly, unless Roebuck could push his improvised machine far beyond what it was ever meant to do. Roebuck pulled himself upright as the Wichita steadied from her hard turn. The catwalk vibrated under his boots. Steady, rhythmic, unnatural. Not engine tremor, not hull flex. This was external. A new salvo inbound. He pressed the diaphragm to the steel again. The resonance needle jittered, twitched left, then lurched right. A strange pattern. Too fast, too shallow. Roebuck frowned. That wasn't battleship fire. It was cruiser fire, lighter guns, closer range. The Japanese force wasn't just hunting them. It was coordinating. Somewhere out there, likely screened by the battleship's thunder, a Japanese heavy cruiser was slipping into position to pinch the Wichita between crossfires. Hensley's voice crackled through the line. "Roebuck, your readings just spiked. What have you got?" Roebuck steadied the device and closed his eyes not to hear better, but to feel better. Sound traveled through steel differently depending on source. Battleship guns rolled deep like underwater earthquakes, while cruisers cracked sharply across the hull like snapping cables. He felt the vibration again, sharper this time, closer, much closer. He opened his eyes. "Chief, we've got a second shooter," he shouted. "Japanese cruiser firing from our starboard quadrant. Bearing 350. Silence on the line, half a second, maybe less. Then Hensley, all turrets shift starboard. Gunner stand by." Roebuck gripped the railing as the Wichita banked slightly during the maneuver. The battleship salvos were still booming somewhere off their port beam, but now a sharper, more rapid rhythm echoed through the hull. 3 gun volleys from a cruiser trying to zero them in. The first splash erupted 50 yards off their bow. They were being bracketed. Roebuck pressed the diaphragm down harder, ignoring the sting of cold metal and salt water. The needle bounced frantically. Too much interference, too many overlapping shockwaves. He needed a cleaner signal, but there was a problem. A fresh ripple in the steel vibrated under his hands. Low, sustained, irregular. Engine strain. Wichita was pushing too hard, too fast. The maneuver to dodge the battleship salvos had forced the engine rooms into near maximum output, and the boilers were taking a beating. The chief engineer would have to throttle back soon or risk blowing a feed line. If Wichita slowed, she'd be a sitting duck between 2 hunting ships. Roebuck swallowed hard. His device wasn't made for this. Too many signals crossing, too much hull vibration. The readings were blurring together. He lifted the diaphragm, then hesitated. A thought hit him. What if the deck plates were too loud, but the duraluminum walkway beneath the aft 40mm gun mount was quieter? He grabbed his device, sprinting aft. Spray hammered him. Crewmen shouted as he weaved past ammunition handlers and radio men. The Wichita fired a full turret broadside off the starboard beam, the concussion staggering him sideways. He reached a walkway and dropped to his knees, pressing the diaphragm to the thinner metal. The resonance was different here, cleaner, less echo. He tapped the gauge. The needle snapped sharply, then sharply again. Two distinct sources, two distinct firing intervals. Roebuck's heart pounded. Gunnery, this is Roebuck. Separating signals now. Stand by for new bearings. He twisted the manual filter dial. An improvised frequency separator copied from a downed aircraft's radio panel. The needle drifted, then steadied. First pattern, deep, slow, massive. Battleships. Second pattern, fast, sharp, closer. The cruiser. He read the bearings. His stomach dropped. Enemy cruiser closing. Bearing 357. Range approximately 12,000 yards and closing fast. A new voice cut in the bridge officer. Roebuck, confirm range. He double-checked, rechecked, then answered, confirmed. They're trying to cut US off. Shouting erupted on the bridge channel. Hensley barked orders. Turrets slewed again. And then it hit Roebuck. Something was wrong. The battleship firing pattern had changed. The delay between salvos tightening. Not random, not a mistake. They had found Wichita's new course. They were preparing a full coordinated crossfire. Roebuck's breath caught in his throat. The Wichita was about to sail straight into a kill zone. An X-shaped convergence of shell fire calibrated by two enemy ships. Unless he could outthink both of them at once. Roebuck forced himself to breathe, slow, controlled. Despite the chaos pounding through the Wichita's steel bones, the ship vibrated under the recoil of her own guns. Spray flew in sheets. Alarms bleated across the deck. And somewhere beyond the black horizon, two Japanese warships, a battleship, and a heavy cruiser were tightening their firing solutions with deadly precision. He pressed the diaphragm of his device against the duraluminum walkway again. The resonance needle jerked violently, then steadied, then twitched in a way Roebuck had never seen. He froze. That twitch meant only one thing. The battleship's newest salvo wasn't aimed at where the Wichita was, but where she would be in 40 seconds. A predictive firing pattern, deadly, accurate, and absolutely lethal if the cruiser's fire overlapped at the same instant. Hensley cut through the gun line with a sharp voice. Roebuck, we need a counterbearing now. What are they doing? Roebuck closed his eyes and felt the vibrations through the hull, long, rolling tremors overlapping with sharper, snapping cracks. One set was widening left, the other closing right. The enemy ships weren't just coordinating. They were corralling the Wichita, driving her into an invisible box of converging fire. He tore off his headset, ran, past ammo handlers, past grim-faced gunners, past men crouched behind steel plating as the Wichita fired another broadside. He reached the port side bulkhead and slammed his device down, pressed the diaphragm, read the gauge. The cruiser's vibrations were closer now, overlapping with the battleship's low rumble, almost merging, almost perfectly timed. Roebuck's eyes widened. That's not random, he whispered. They're syncing up. A synchronized crossfire pattern was rare, complex, requiring both ships to coordinate by radio or prearranged timing. It was a tactic meant to overwhelm a single target too damaged to maneuver. The Wichita was at target. Roebuck bolted back to the voice tube, breath ripping from his lungs. Bridge, listen. They're trying to sink salvos. They want US locked between both lines of fire. The bridge officer replied, strained. We can't evade both ships at once, Roebuck. Roebuck slammed his palm against the railing. You don't have to evade both. You just have to confuse one. He knelt again, pressing the diaphragm hard. The gauge trembled, jumped, held steady. There, a flaw. A tiny misalignment in the battleship's firing rhythm. Just a few tenths of a second where the sound delay lagged. Roebuck's mind raced. If the Wichita suddenly altered speed and heading at exactly the moment the battleship was adjusting its firing delay, it would throw off the entire crossfire timing. Not by much. Seconds. Maybe less. But seconds in naval gunnery meant survival. He grabbed the voice tube and bellowed. Bridge. You have to execute a hard turn and speed shift On my mark. Exact timing. Any earlier or later, and we'll sail right into it. Silence. Then the captain's voice, calm, cold. Roebuck, we're trusting you. Call it. Roebuck planted his device on the deck, both hands gripping it. The vibrations rolled in, deep, overlapping, approaching critical synchrony. He counted backward in his head. 5, 4, 3. The gauge jittered. 2, 1. There, he screamed. Mark. Full starboard rudder. Engines. Flood to 28 knots. The Wichita groaned, heels hard. Spray exploding across the deck as engines roared in a split second. Risky surge that strained every boiler line aboard. Roebuck held his breath. Then the night lit up. 2 massive salvo patterns crashed into the sea, both missing. One landed where the Wichita had been 30 seconds earlier. The other obliterated the ocean exactly where she should have been if she'd held speed. Roebuck staggered. He'd done it. He'd broken the sync. But then the needle on his device lurched wildly. A new pattern. Faster, closer, heavier. Roebuck's blood ran cold. The battleship wasn't giving up. It was switching to rapid half salvos, a brutal, relentless firing cycle meant to drown the target in steel. And now, thanks to the turn he'd ordered, the Wichita was sailing straight into range of the heaviest guns in the Japanese formation. Roebuck tightened his grip on the device. The real fight was just beginning. Roebuck braced himself against the catwalk railing as the Wichita surged into her new heading, engines howling in protest. The ship carved a sharp arc through the black water, spray blasting across the bow. Every deck plate vibrated under a rising thunder. A relentless boom, boom, boom rolling across the sea in uneven waves. The Japanese battleship had shifted to rapid half salvos. Instead of firing full broadsides every 30 seconds, it was now alternating its turrets, left, right, left, creating a strobing wall of fire meant to correct aim faster and saturate a target before it could maneuver. It was the naval equivalent of a sledgehammer repeatedly striking the same point. Roebuck pressed the diaphragm of his device to the walkway again. The needle slammed right, twitched, corrected, twitched again. The battleship was adjusting course, tightening pursuit. Hensley burst over the gun line. Roebuck. Range is closing. They're running US down. Roebuck didn't answer immediately. He felt the hull tremble under him. Not a hit, yet but a pressure wave so close it made his teeth buzz. A monstrous plume of water rose off the starboard quarter, towering over the deck like a liquid cliff. 50 yards closer, and it would have snapped the Wichita's keel. He swallowed hard. They had minutes, maybe less. He tightened his grip on the device. The signal wasn't just strong, it was focused. The battleship was locking its corrections more precisely with each half salvo. Roebuck forced himself to think. The enemy wasn't guessing anymore. They were reading Wichita's pattern, her speed, her turning rate. They were adapting. Another explosion thundered into the sea ahead. This one angled perfectly along Wichita's projected path. Spray engulfed the bow, drenching the forecastle. The Japanese gunners were predicting Wichita's evasive behavior. Roebuck's pulse hammered. There was no trick left in his device. No new calibration. He had already pushed it far past its intended limits. Unless he blinked. A memory surfaced, dull, half forgotten, from his training as a boiler tech before the war. Sound traveled through steel differently depending on temperature, tension, and mechanical load. If Wichita changed engine rhythm, not just speed, the hull would vibrate in a completely new pattern, one the enemy couldn't interpret in time. It was insane, irresponsible, potentially catastrophic. But so was being annihilated by a 40,000-ton battleship at point-blank gunnery range. Roebuck grabbed the nearest voice tube. Engine room, Roebuck. Listen carefully. I need a staggered load shift, altered boilers. A baffled engineer replied. You want us to what? Stagger the steam feed. Make the ship vibrate differently. Throw off their range finding. That'll hammer the lines. We could blow a gasket. We'll blow more than that if you don't do it. A long pause. Then, staggering boilers. The shift hit instantly. The Wichita's hull shuddered in an unnatural uneven rhythm. Engines surging in pulses. like a heartbeat out of tempo. Roebuck pressed the diaphragm down. The needle jittered wildly. Good, he shouted into the gunnery line. Hensley, their fire solution will miss for the next 15 seconds. Get your shots in. Turrets roared. The Wichita vomited flame across the sea, her 8-inch guns belching fire into the darkness. And then, a new sound, the deepest Roebuck had ever felt. The battleship fired again. The hull trembled. Roebuck held his breath. The sea ahead erupted. Too far. The splash was off by more than 100 yards. The vibration trick worked. For now, but the battleship readjusted rapidly. Its next salvo closer. The next closer still. The staggered boiler trick bought seconds, not safety. And now the Wichita was committed to a turning arc from which she couldn't easily break free. Then Roebuck felt something different. Very different. A growing tremor, low, steady, rhythmic, coming from behind him. He spun. The Wichita's own destroyer screen, previously scattered by the night engagement, was racing back into position. And one of them, USS Preston, charged directly between Wichita and the battleship's line of fire, firing smoke, launching star shells, and blasting her 5-inch guns in a furious distraction. The battleship's next half salvo overshot, aiming toward the Preston instead of Wichita. Roebuck exhaled sharply, sagging against the railing. The cruiser was no longer the sole focus of the Japanese guns. Roebuck, Hensley barked through the line. We're shifting fire. Keep feeding us bearings, just in case. Roebuck nodded, repositioning his device on the deck, as Wichita's turrets unleashed another blistering broadside into the dark. He watched the resonance needle steady, then soften, then flatten. The enemy salvos were drifting, erratic, losing cohesion. They were turning away. Minutes later, the horizon felt quiet except for the thrum of engines and the hiss of trailing smoke. The Japanese ships were retreating. Roebuck slumped back, every muscle in his body shaking, not from cold, but from the realization of what almost happened. His device, slapped together from spare parts and instinct, had bought the Wichita enough time for her destroyer screen to reform. Enough time to survive. Enough time to fight another day. When dawn finally broke over the Philippine Sea, the USS Wichita carried the scars of a night few aboard would ever forget. Her decks were drenched, her paint was blistered, and several bulkheads bore fresh dents from near-miss shockwaves. But she was afloat, still moving, still fighting, because one engineer had refused to accept blindness in the middle of a naval gun duel. Petty Officer Calvin Roebuck sat on a coil of line near Turret 2, wrapped in a blanket, shivering more from adrenaline crash than from cold. The improvised acoustic device, his Frankenstein of scavenged wiring, battered casing, and hand-filed copper contacts, sat beside him, warped and smoking slightly from overuse. It was bent, salt-corroded, half-dead, but it had worked. The ship's combat log would later record that Roebuck's readings allowed Wichita to evade at least 3 lethal salvos from the Japanese battleship and identify the closing approach of the enemy cruiser before it could complete the crossfire. Officers credited his last-ditch call, the boiler stagger maneuver, with buying the seconds needed for USS Preston to rejoin the action. In the end, Wichita survived a situation in which most cruisers would have been obliterated. Roebuck never claimed heroism. When questioned after the battle, he simply said, "Radar's down. Somebody had to see for her, so I listened." After the war, he returned to civilian life and worked as an industrial acoustics technician, a career built on understanding how metal speaks under stress. The device he built that night was quietly removed during an overhaul and never preserved, but its memory lived on in the engine rooms and gun mounts of the Wichita's crew. Among sailors who served with him, one phrase endured. When the lights went blind, Roebuck heard the enemy coming. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps keep these long-form historical war stories alive. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family ever served at sea. And if you want more cinematic, deeply researched war narratives every week, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.